We're going to move once again into studio. Former Israeli Deputy National Security Advisor Dr. Chuck Freilich still with me. Dr. Freilich, of course, Mike is referring to Lieberman heading to Russia tonight. How much faith is there that Russia, in fact, will agree to these Israeli demands to have Iranian forces pushed back from its northern border, and how big of a game changer would this be?
Well, I think the first question is, what is the alternative? And the answer is, well, the United States isn't playing much of a role in Syria today. And if the Russians can't act as a mediator, or it's not really a mediator, but as a force which will push the Iranians back, then that leaves it up to us. And that means that we have to do it militarily. And that's an option which is, of course, not a terribly attractive one. So I would say, first of all, let's hope that the Russians do it. Then the question is how much they will do it. I think they have an interest in preventing a serious deterioration on the Syrian front. I think they got scared by what happened a few weeks ago when things were escalating in Syria, where there was even a vague possibility of a clash between Israeli and Russian forces. And they have an interest now in trying to keep a lid on things. I don't think that they'll push the Iranians back as far as we want. I think they'll do more than we could achieve otherwise without having to go a military route. So that's a good thing.
All right. International Affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini also with us in studio. Now, of course, it always makes waves when there's discussion between Israel and Iran. Now we're looking at Israel, the northern border here, where Iranian troops are based in Syria. Looking, though, at this recent uptick in violence on its southern border with Gaza, how is this being consumed or covered internationally?
Well, it's an interesting question, because here in Israel, it was a major story, right? In all of the media outlets. For people in the area, of course, it overshadowed everything. But also in Tel Aviv, in Jerusalem, you know, we were looking at our phones. There were this app warning of incoming rockets. It really felt quite worrying and pressing, and that's how it was covered. Now, internationally, the rest of the world didn't take as strong an interest, honestly. It was covered. There were correspondents on the ground. There were articles, of course. But when you consider that this was the largest flare-up since 2014, it didn't make that many headlines. Part of this could be because there were no casualties, luckily. And we know that with international media, that just gets less airtime. And some experts are also pointing to sort of a fatigue, a general level of fatigue when it comes to these flare-ups and the Israeli-Palestinian conflict overall. It's going on for a long time. It's quite complex. And when you look at a global scale, it simply doesn't always make the main focus. But it is really worth noting how differently it was covered internationally here, considering how serious it was.
Sure. Now, that's, of course, the media reaction. What kind of response are we hearing diplomatically?
Well, we heard from representatives from the UN and from the EU yesterday quite quickly, very clear condemnation of the firing of the rockets, calling it unacceptable. We even had the mayor of Frankfurt urging a funding freeze for the Palestinians. We heard the Prime Minister of Canada saying Israel has the right to defend itself. So really, overall, a harsh condemnation given with no reservation. And that's a little bit of a different tone, perhaps, than we're used to. Typically, when we hear these responses in events similar to this one, Hamas will be condemned, and in the same breath, both parties are asked to show restraint. That often frustrates a lot of Israelis, and it seems like it might have been a little bit different
What's your take on that, Dr. Freilich?
Well, first of all, it was interesting you were talking about the fatigue. There was no fatigue a couple of weeks ago when the demonstrations were going on the border. So there's, as usual, the double standard. But I'd like to put this whole issue into a little bit of perspective. The last few weeks have been tough. Let's remember we just celebrated our 70th anniversary. And the really big story isn't these flare-ups, because we've had them. They've been going on for decades. Again, unfortunately, they'll be going on for years. The big news is that Israel is 70 years old. We are here. We are a fundamentally secure state. We're a prosperous state. And we can handle, there are serious threats out there, but we can handle them. And there's much to be happy about as we continue to celebrate the 70th year. Very
briefly, because we have to go out for a break, but can you really compare the events of what happened yesterday to May 14, 15 and the protests from March 30? Are you comparing the same thing here?
No, of course it's different, because, I mean, the impact on the Israeli public is much greater than that was. On the other hand, the PR impact in the world was much greater when those events happened. This, for us, is a direct security threat, and so that is more important.
All right, Dr. Chuck Freilich, appreciate that insight, and of course, international affairs correspondent Bianca Zanini, thank you for that.